Hello and welcome to the Order of Night George YouTube channel. I'm your host, Reverend Jake Zabel, also known as Night Jake. This is another one of my creation theory videos. I haven't done one for a while, generally because it really depends if I have a theory about stuff related to creation. So what is the creation theory series that I do on this YouTube channel? Well, I'm not an expert creation scientist. I'm not an expert scientist. I'm a creationist. I'm a minister of theology. I'm not an expert in any science, let alone creation science. But the purpose of these videos is that I have some kind of scientific theory related to the creationism, and I want to put them out there onto the internet for others to think about, discuss, criticize, give me some feedback on. Let me know if my theory has some weight or whether my theory is absolute nonsense. So I've done some videos in the past. You can go check those out. But on today's one, I'm going to be talking about the 4 rivers in the Garden of Eden. So in Genesis chapter 2, when God creates the Garden of Eden, it states that there are 4 rivers that flow through the garden. And it said a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Benium and onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cus. And the name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. Now there are 2 of these rivers that we can identify, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they join up. And they are kind of east of Assyria, where Assyria used to be, so we can kind of identify those rivers. But then, the land of Cus is modern-day Ethiopia, and so this would mean that the river called Gihon here is actually the river Nile. And then which river is the Pishon? Well, Josephus, in his History of the Jews, identified the river Pishon with the river Ganges, since he identified the land of Havilah with the land of India. So this would put the Gihon in Egypt and Ethiopia, Tigris in the Euphrates in the Middle East, and the Pishon over in India. And people were like, well, hold on, those rivers don't join. They are not 4 joined rivers. And so one theory that has always been proposed by creation scientists is, that was just the names pre-flood, and that after the flood, people just used old names to rename these rivers. Except, why would Moses, who's writing this, also talk about Assyria and Cush and Havilah, lands that Moses knew? Moses is most likely referring to rivers in his own day. And so he may have said, well, the Nile is the river Gihon, the Ganges is the river Pishon, these 2 rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, are the Tigris and Euphrates, since Moses was the one that wrote Genesis. And so he may actually have known those rivers to be those 4 rivers. But then this leads back to the issue, well, how come in Eden they come together as one river? Only the Tigris and the Euphrates actually join up in our world. So people go, well, obviously this is just myth, this is legend, the creation is wrong, Genesis is wrong, blah, 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 blah. Well, here's my theory. So, many creation scientists believe in the idea of the supercontinent of Pangaea, meaning from the Greek pan, all, Gea, land, so all land. Specifically, if you look at the 3rd day of creation, when you see that God creates the land, he calls it the land and the sea. He doesn't call it lands and seas. He refers to one land mass and one sea mass, yet we know from our current era there are numerous continents, there are numerous oceans. Many creationists believe that there was the one giant Pangaea supercontinent at the time of the creation. That's what Adam and Eve walked on. That's even what Noah would have walked on. They believe that during Noah's flood, when the fountains of the deep ripped open, and that you had this kind of great worldwide flood, that the tectonic plates basically just got pushed around and separated. which, I mean, just itself brings to mind a new image of Noah's flood, that when you think of Noah's flood, just don't imagine water, but imagine the tectonic plates being ripped apart, and magma and lava and volcanoes erupting, and the water just gushing into these giant gorges of like magma, and there's just steam shooting up. It is quite a hectic, chaotic picture. So my point is that actually many creationists have believed that the breakup of the continents is something that was not caused by a million years, but that this was a single event caused by Noah's flood, that we went from Pangea, and when the flood was ended, the continents rested roughly where they are now. The continents kind of move a little bit these days, but not to such a great extent. And so, yeah, many creation scientists believe that the continental drift was not a gradual process, but something that was caused by the impact of Noah's flood. Also, if you look in the Psalms, it talks about God raising up mountains and lowering valleys to mark the boundaries of the flood waters. That since basically all land had been covered by water, in order to bring the land mass above sea level, God had to drop valleys so that the sea level would go down into the trenches and raise the continents up so that they could actually be taller. So that is God using his supernatural powers to, lower valleys and raise mountains. But what is the natural physical, outcome of God doing that? Well, we know when tectonic plates push against each other, they can push down and create valleys, they can push up and create mountains, they can rip apart and create valleys as well. And like a good example of all this is the Himalayas. When the Indian tectonic plate crashes into the Asian tectonic plate, it pushes up and creates the Himalayan mountain range. So if we believe that the continental drift happened during Noah's flood, and that this raising of mountains was, something that happened towards the end of the flood, well, we could assume that during the flood, Pangea broke up and the tectonic plates went everywhere, and so when the Indian plate then crashed into the Asian plate during Noah's flood, that was the raising of the mountains. Now, this is the point that I want to make. If the tectonic plates have all moved around, entire continents are moving. So it may be possible that the Nile, the Ganges, Tigris, and Euphrates rivers were once all kind of connected at some point, where they could form this river that flowed into Eden. But as the tectonic plates moved, continents moved, and so the Tigris and the Euphrates stayed connected, but the Ganges or Pishon and the Nile or Gihon actually got separated as their actual entire tectonic plate moved. The thing that I want to point about is, when the tectonic plates moved, doesn't mean that the rivers have to stop being there. The rivers could still be in their place, but the whole plate has moved around. So maybe the Ganges and the Tigris and Euphrates did have somewhere where they joined together, but when the plate split up, that join was severed. And if you have the Ganges in the Indian plate moving around and then crashing up into the Asian plate, well then that's the whole river Ganges that's on that tectonic plate, known as the Indian plate, is moving. And so this is my creation theory, that actually the rivers that we have are the original rivers that are mentioned in Eden. They are the Nile or Gihon, the Ganges or Pishon, and the Tigris and Euphrates. These are actually the original rivers from the days of Adam. These aren't just names given to some new rivers based off of older rivers that they knew of, but these are actually the original rivers from before Noah's flood, and that due to Noah's flood, when the tectonic plates got shifted around, those rivers that used to be connected are no longer connected. So that's my creation theory. If you think I've got some weight to this theory, I'd like to hear about it. If you've got something to add, I'd like to hear that too. If you've got a criticism, I don't necessarily. If you've got a criticism, I wouldn't like to hear that, but I'm willing to hear criticism if you think I'm wrong, if you think there's something that I've got wrong and confused here. Like I said, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a creation scientist, and so I may not have all the scientific facts down right, but this is just a theory that I want to put out there into the internet world so that I can get some feedback and that others can think about this. Maybe there's something people haven't thought about before. Maybe people have thought about this, and there's a reason why this is not a common theory. Basically, this is my theory regarding the rivers of the Garden of Eden. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye, and God bless.